So we're back again with Dr. Yolanda Céspedes, who is a stress and anxiety specialist. She also specializes in the treatment of OCD, which is more scientifically known as obsessive compulsive disorder. And Yolanda, thank you so much for your graciousness in coming back and having a conversation with us. Would you mind unpacking for us what is OCD?
My pleasure, and thank you for having me. OCD is comprised really of two distinct experiences. So on the one hand, we have the experience of the obsession, which is the O in OCD. And we often think of obsessions as being thoughts. They're not always thoughts. They're often thoughts, but they can also be images or urges that pop in. And they're experienced as being unwanted, intrusive, and uncontrollable. And they really instill in us a sense of fear and of dread, sometimes even disgust and shame. They're extremely unpleasant in their experience, and they compel us to do something about them because they're so strong.
I'm curious, compel, does that then take us into that compulsion part of the OCD?
Yeah, that's actually a really nice segue. So that's the other half of OCD, the compulsion, which is the thing that we do to try to alleviate the distress of the obsession. And compulsions can take different forms. Sometimes they're really obvious and they're really easy to see. And sometimes they're very hidden and masked. But what they all do is they take time. They tend to interfere quite a bit in our day-to-day lives. And what they all do, and the reason we do them, is because they're unfortunately pretty effective in giving us some relief from the obsession. They tend to work, at least in the short term. So the obsession, that intrusive thing pops in, that makes us really uncomfortable and scared. And then we do something in the moment to make that go away so that we can get a sense of relief and feel okay again.
Could you give some examples of obsessions and their relief-giving compulsion? I mean, I think it's so interesting because I know as somebody who specializes in anxiety myself, we work so much with cognitions and thoughts. And so it'd be really wonderful and helpful for us to hear, kind of the A plus B, this obsession and this compulsion might go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Let's start with some types that are really common, that we tend to see frequently and that some folks might be really familiar with. So one type of obsession is centered around fears of contamination. So worries about dirt, germs, disease, illness.
That's a big one these days too.
And especially now with the pandemic, there's some level of that's rather normative in today's times. And so that sort of amplifies the experience for some folks. And so what happens is that obsession sets in, right? Maybe they touch a doorknob that they perceive as dirty or contaminated. And then the worries about maybe I'll get sick. What if I catch a disease? What if I spread disease? So you can see that would fill us with dread and worry and fear. And so what do? We seek a way out. That's sort of the natural state of things for humans, is we don't like being in a state of discomfort and fear and dread. That's a scary space. So we want to do something about it. And that's the compulsion, right? So lots of folks will wash their hands. Right. So that will give me some relief. Okay, I've washed that dirt away, I've washed those germs away. Now I'm safe. Now the people around me are safe.
Now, because if I touch something, yuck, then I want to certainly go wash my hands, or even, coming back from the grocery store these days. I mean, first, I should do this anyway, but during the pandemic, I go to the grocery store, I come home, and I definitely do a good scrub. What's the difference between my scrub as somebody who does not have the experience of OCD versus somebody who is struggling with this disorder?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that we see differences on both ends, both on the obsessive end and on the compulsive end. One is folks that are doing what we would expect would be a normative amount of hand washing. They don't get stuck in the worries and the thinking about it. That the experience for someone with OCD is that it is repeated and intrusive and uncontrollable. and it keeps coming back. So even after I washed my hands, that may not be the end of it. I may still continue to have the experience of worry or dread about it. And on the compulsive end, hand washing for, what the experts say, right? 20 seconds under warm water with some soap, and then that's really all that we need.
Yeah.
With folks with OCD, that often doesn't feel like it's enough. And what we see is sometimes snowballing of compulsions where washing my hands isn't quite enough. Now I need to wash them for longer, or in a specific type of way, in a specific sequence, with a specific type of soap. What we would consider sort of the recommended type of behavior becomes exaggerated, and for some folks can take lots of time. Oftentimes folks with OCD may spend hours in engaging in their compulsion and have their days be so disrupted.
Now, you mentioned that's a more commonly known type of obsession and compulsion. What's one that's a little more unusual that you've worked with that, to me, as somebody on the outside, might feel unusual, but to you as an expert in this space, a lot of people do actually experience and struggle with?
Yeah. So one that is maybe less common or less known about is harm OCD. And that's the case where someone has fears around safety and causing harm, often to another person. We see this sometimes among parents who have these intrusive, sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's a thought of them hurting somebody, of them hurting their child. And so that is experienced not just as scary, but also they may feel a sense of what's wrong with me? Why am I thinking this? And it's important to know that folks with OCD, when they have these types of thoughts, it's something that doesn't feel aligned with who they are. It's extremely distressing. And they will tell you, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to have this thought, but it keeps popping in. And so that's one that we see that's a little bit less common or less well known. And so the obsession is that scary thought or image that pops in. And the compulsion is everything that that person does to stay safe and keep everyone safe. They might stay away from things that they could use to harm somebody. They might do a lot of checking to make sure things are okay.
It reminds me of, we've had some clients in the past who have trauma related obsessive compulsive disorder. And they'll have a version of that where they're, because of what's happened to them, it's as though their story, their narrative brain is now saying, what if I could do that to somebody because it has happened to me? And then there's a lot of isolation and kind of desperation and shame that starts to build up over the course of time.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a really unique facet of this type of OCD. We often think of OCD as being centered around anxiety and distress, but for some folks, the nature of their OCD really has a lot to do with themselves and their narrative and their story, and how they see themselves in the world. And that's another layer of it that's really challenging, because they start to question themselves and who they are.
So, what does treatment look like for this? What type of, I know we're going to do another couple videos here, but I don't want to, this feels heavy and it's big and it's hard.
Mm.
And
So the good news is that we've got really good treatments to support folks with OCD. I think of OCD as, at its core, really being about uncertainty. So if you look at the kinds of things that folks engage in when they're engaging in their compulsions, it's really a way to try to seek certainty, make sure that things are okay. So part of what we want to do is sort of help folks understand that, so that we can help them shift from this needing to make sure that somebody is safe or that something happens in a particular way, and shifting it to being able to tolerate doubt and tolerate uncertainty. And that's a really helpful way, going back to what you were talking about with thoughts, just understanding what it is that really is at the heart of our fear. It's that we're always seeking to make sure about things. So part of what we're trying to do is support that ability to tolerate doubt and uncertainty.
Now, I know you are a mindfulness expert. So immediately I'm starting to hear of that space between the emotional brain and the thinking brain. So I would imagine there's some mindfulness work that's brought in here. What other tools do you use?
Yeah. There's also an evidence-based treatment that's known as exposure and response prevention. And this is an extremely effective way of helping folks break their OCD cycle. So that cycle that we were seeing between obsessions, something pops in that's making me uncomfortable, it's causing distress, and the compulsion that I engage in that then gives me a little bit of relief,
Hmm.
right? But that relief is only temporary until the next time that obsession pops back up. Next time I'm faced with having to touch something I think might be dirty, right? Those things, life is always throwing those kinds of things at us. And so it's really easy to get stuck in this cycle where every time I feel uncomfortable, I do something to get myself out of it. So what we want to do is break that. And that's where exposure and response prevention comes in. And I'm going to break that down for the exposure side of things, which sounds a little bit scary, but all we're doing is we're helping the brain to rewire itself so that it doesn't get activated when something scary happens. We're helping it sort of recalibrate its threshold a little bit
Hmm.
so that, much like dipping your toes into a cold pool, right? You had that experience of getting your toes into a cold pool. It feels freezing at first. And then with a little bit of time, your body naturally gets used to it. It doesn't feel quite as cold. It even sometimes feels warm.
Hmm.
We can apply that same strategy to all the things that make us uncomfortable in the world of OCD. So we're basically helping our brain to dip our toes into that discomfort and learn to get used to it. And the response prevention piece is blocking the thing that we would normally do, right? So rather than getting up and running out of the pool, which is one way to get out of the cold water, we can learn to sit with it and just let our body do what it's designed to do, which is to get used to stuff. And we can apply that to OCD in really gentle, manageable, bite-sized doses. But it's a way of doing some rewiring so that that alarm doesn't go off so easily.
Now you're mentioning rewiring, and I know you're part of our neuroscience-based group practice here in Pasadena, and so you're clearly speaking brain. Are there some other modalities that you bring in? Because the exposure and response prevention is behavior and thinking. How does the brain play out, or what tools do you use for the brain part of all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I love bringing in another type of intervention, which is called havening techniques, which is really grounded in neuroscience and speaks that brain language that you were talking about. So while ERP, or exposure and response prevention, really does help to rewire the system and get the system used to discomfort, the havening techniques is a beautiful add-on to that. It does a number of things. One is it provides a tool for managing in the moment distress. So if something comes up in real time that is particularly activating, it gives you a strategy that you can use to sort of calm the system down. And we often learn strategies to calm the body down, but havening is a way of calming the brain down. And so that's a really helpful adjunct. Most of us don't know any tricks for calming the brain down. Havening can also be really helpful for building resiliency, because what we want to help folks do is not just manage their symptoms and always feel like they're in a state of coping and managing, but that they can approach the world with a sense of strength and resiliency, so that when life does throw those curveballs, they feel like they can move forward with a sense of agency. Folks with OCD often feel out of control and
Yeah.
feel like OCD is running the show. And so this is a way of giving them back a sense of control, putting them back in the driver's seat instead of OCD, and building up a sense of assuredness.
Well, thank you, Yolanda, so much for coming and joining us today and kind of unpacking the ins and outs of OCD and giving us an introduction to some of these tools that you use. I know this is an area you've been working in for a really long time, and it's just wonderful to have your expertise here. And I know we'll be doing a couple more videos where we dive more deeply into ERP and some of these other tools and techniques that you use. So any final thoughts that you have for anybody who's navigating the world with OCD, or loves somebody who's living in this painful space?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Actually, it's really common for those of us that know somebody with OCD to get pulled in to
Hmm.
the experience. That's that OCD cycle. Sometimes the compulsions involve other people, because it's a way of helping ourselves to feel safe, right? Helping our brains to feel safe in the moment. So I guess my parting invitation is that there is treatment that is really effective, and that we don't need to feel like OCD is running the show, as if OCD is sort of setting the rules that we need to live by, that there's a way of creating agency. And there are ways that family members can also learn to help break that OCD cycle alongside their loved ones.
Well, thank you. And that's very hopeful because we live in a system.
Yeah.
So I will see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.